I'm very pleased today to introduce Aneesh Chopra, who's the author of Innovative State, How New Technologies Can Transform Government, and we will have a book sale and signing after the talk. So I think as way of an introduction, I'm just going to read the inside front quote, which is, as the federal government's first chief technology officer, Aneesh Chopra did groundbreaking work to bring our government into the 21st century. His legacy of leadership and innovation will benefit Americans for years to come, and that is from President Obama. So I think that's as good an introduction as we need, but we're thrilled to have Aneesh here. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Hi, everybody. Good evening. Point of housekeeping. One, this is home for me. I grew up in Plainsboro, New Jersey. Mom and Dad are here, and so many a time I found myself meandering onto the campus for lots of reasons, and so the opportunity to come back is one I could never turn down. I have great fondness for this place. Housekeeping item number 2, I wanted to get to know you better before I dove into my remarks, and so in that regard, how many of you are entrepreneurs? Okay, we got a few on this side, hardly on this side. It's going to be an interesting question. I'm going to come back to it at the end to see if you might look at yourself differently given the remarks we're going to make. How many of you believe government's working?
Which government?
Our U.S. government. Okay, right. And how many of you are here tonight because you want to believe that government can work again? Is that why you're here? Okay. Good. I will give you the punchline at the front end, which is yes. And more importantly, it's bipartisan. And more bizarrely, my experience in Washington was one of 2 Washingtons. I got along with Eric Cantor. And we actually got legislation through that the president signed into law with joint enthusiasm and excitement. And K. Billy Hutchison joined forces hand in hand with Senator Rockefeller to think anew about the nation's broadband, and in this case it's wireless infrastructure. And we've put together consensus recommendations that are signed into law. There's a whole set of things that are what I might describe as active ingredients for an innovative state that are all signed into law. We don't need to wish a day for someone to champion these ideas. The purpose of my talk is to inform you of them and then to motivate your use of them in helping to achieve this vision of a more effective and functioning democracy. So I'm going to walk you through some background, some historical context, and then some news you can use. Everything that you can do literally tomorrow without asking permission, without seeking some presidential hookup in order to get involved. And I'm hopeful that that might plant some seeds for those of you in this room who are so inclined to help solve the challenges and the issues that you are more passionate about. Because if each of us take a step into that direction, we will see the benefits of a more innovative state. So, here's the outline. I am hopeful. That's the most obvious point. I'm going to provide for you some context, and then that playbook that I outlined with some specific tools that you can engage on right now. So, with all my excitement and enthusiasm and hopefulness, I guess I should note at the beginning that government doesn't work. And while this story has been updated, which I'll describe at the end, but certainly at the time in October of 2013, this was not our finest hour. While I was not directly engaged in this particular website launch, I definitely understood the context and the circumstances in which this failure happened, and it was frustrating. But the bigger point I thought I'd raise with you is that the sentiment captured by the sentence in the middle, that the system is down at the moment, to me, was that metaphor about the country. You know, it's not the website. The website can be fixed. It's the notion that we just can't agree that the sky is blue. And meanwhile, for those of you that are concerned internationally, you know, growing countries around the world are demonstrating a commitment to be more open, welcoming immigrants, putting their best and brightest to work and inventing a better future. And you sort of look at what's happening in these emerging economies and you wonder, gee, were our best days behind us, or is this, you know, is the system being down at the moment not only annoying in the short run, but devastating for the long run? That's the sentiment, and I wanted to capture that up front because I want to acknowledge it. I'm not here to say, well, oh, that's baloney. Let's just talk about the happy talk. No, I want to acknowledge. But what I wanted to also share with you is that we've had a long history of a pioneering government, going back to our founding. Now, those of you that study math, you might understand this concept or statistics, reversion to the mean. Have you all been taught reversion to the mean? So if you take the long view, we've had more periods where the public sector has been at a minimum as innovative as the private sector, but many moments when we've actually been more innovative in the public sector relative to the private sector. That doesn't feel like the world we're living in today, but with that longer lens and view, you'd say, geez, maybe if I saw nothing else in Aneesh's lecture that I liked, I kind of get the idea of reversion to the mean, we should come back. We should come back. And here are just some examples in case you haven't, and not to talk about other books when I'm here about my own, but a very good friend of mine, Michael Lind, runs the New America Foundation, and he had authored a book, Land of Promise, which I would recommend if you wanted an economic history of the country. And he shared countless examples of more entrepreneurial public sector and public servants. Some of my most favorite, by the way, there's a very famous building if you visited DC, the Building Museum, which its original purpose was to make it easier to process pension benefits for veterans. And because there was so much paperwork involved, the innovation at the time was that the designer of the building had built essentially divots on either side of these desks so that young boys, and they were young boys, could more efficiently move large reams of paper while the clerks processed the applications. They were more efficient in processing paperwork because of this physical design. Obviously, the Pony Express was an example of an innovation. You know, we moved to the horse, but it cut in half the time to deliver mail across the country. If you fast forward, the Postal Service should get the credit for our airline industry, because had the Postal Service not made commitments to essentially buy seats on planes for the transport of mail, we would not have had a vibrant commercial airline industry. But perhaps the most famous, and the one that I would imagine most of you are familiar with, is the story of Hollerith at the Census Bureau. In the 1870s, the census was getting harder and harder to tally. We were using manual processes, and so many immigrants were coming in the late 1800s that it had been the case, the presumption, that we would not be able to get the census done within the decade. It would have been the end of the 1800s would have been the first decade we would not have gotten the only constitutional homework assignment done on time, and that would have been a bummer. So Hollerith decides to solve this problem through ingenuity. He designs a tabulating machine that automates much of the work that they were doing manually, and it was so successful, that tabulating machine formed the basis of what company? Thank you. You all know the story. But what you may not remember is that it's a government employee. Of course, he gets the entrepreneurial bug, and we celebrate Hollerith, but he worked in a system as a public servant, and that talent, that capacity is in every division, every bureau, every cabinet agency in the federal government. It's just the system that doesn't bring it out. I mentioned bipartisanship. Of course, I'm a Democrat, for those of you who follow, not that I care about your politics, but just to be honest about who I am and what I do. So I'm a card-carrying member of the Bill Clinton fan club. I grew up in the era where Bill Clinton could do no wrong. And I remember reinventing government as this amazing initiative that Al Gore and Bill Clinton championed. But what I didn't realize was that the underlying ideas had their origins in a very bipartisan supper club, the New Paradigm Society. It turned out that Father Bush had a domestic policy advisor named James Pinkerton, a conservative. And James Pinkerton had a counterparty who would eventually become the leader of the Reinventing Government movement, Elaine Kmark, and the two of them conceived of a dinner club called the New Paradigm Society, and Newt Gingrich would participate, backbenchers, forward-looking leaders on both sides of the aisle, and they had this relatively kumbaya-ish mentality, which is whomever wins the 92 election will eventually launch a Reinventing Government initiative. It didn't matter if it was for Clinton or Father Bush, that they were all primed and ready to go. No one had a concern about this being bad or good for politics. And the conclusion at the time was that the predated the innovations in technology that have changed our lives. If you go back at Reinventing Government, they announced that this picture was taken in September of 1993. I'm reading Walter Isaacson's The Innovators, by the way, and he notes, just as I noted in the book, there are only 200 websites in the entire World Wide Web in 1993. So there was no concept, maybe there were concepts, but there was no end production, mobile broadband, big data analytical tools, or any of the more sophisticated cloud computing infrastructures. These things did not really exist, and so while there was bipartisan support, Reinventing Government largely became a management innovation, not so much a technological breakthrough. It's important, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Why do I mention that particular historical artifact? Well, I do so because if you take a look at the assignment the president had given me, some in the transition team might have thought about this as Reinventing Government 2.0. Let's just roll out the playbook and continue. Junior Bush had actually continued Reinventing Government and had done phenomenally impressive things up and until the Iraq War, which obviously took a lot of their time and attention on international matters, and they weren't as focused on the domestic. But, again, the bipartisan consensus had been there. So the president's assignment to me, in many ways, he created the position of Chief Technology Officer. It did not exist. He had done some things that were pretty exciting. Now, for those of us at Woodrow Wilson, we understand org charts. So if you're from the community, you might, if you come to take an audit class or something here, you'll sort of figure out what means what in Washington. What the president had done in creating my position was something a little unprecedented. He named me an assistant to the president, which meant that I reported directly to him. Technically, you wouldn't waste his time on things that are obvious. You would be very respectful about that, but you had the audible you could call if ever there was an issue where a cabinet member wasn't quite playing nicely. You could always call the question. Two, he made me a cabinet member on the National Economic Council and the Domestic Policy Council. So I wasn't staff in the White House. I was in certain hats. But in this matter, I was a principal. That means something for those who follow Washington. It meant that this role had powers far beyond me and like whoever I am. I'm a random dude from Virginia who happened to be in the governor's cabinet. That was like the kind of the farm team, if you will, for what a CTO could do. But the president makes this very powerful declaration about the role. And the assignment is to close the innovation gap. His presumption is that if we could find a way to use all of these new technologies that had obviously empowered his campaign, but also he'd seen in our society, if we could turn these new technologies for good, we might find a way to tap into the expertise of the American people, come up with better ideas, new products, new services, and ways to solve the big challenges that he's been elected to solve. So in responding to the assignment, I wanted to do some homework about diagnosing the root cause problem as to why are we in an innovation gap? Why do we have to close something? As I mentioned, we had Reinventing Government. So what broke? I spent a decade of my professional life in the private sector before entering government at a firm called the Advisory Board. And we did research and best practices. Not only I worked in the healthcare division, but we had also a team looking at the Fortune 2000. My colleagues back in 1997 had written a book which I thought was directly applicable to my assignment, called Stall Points. Their question was, why do seemingly indestructible companies, the best of the best, hit this proverbial brick wall, and in the course of this research study, stall? What is it about the DNA of these companies? Is it some exogenous financial crisis that happens to take out large swaths of our Fortune 2000, or something more internal to the organization? They found three big insights that I thought were relevant to the job. One, stalls are pervasive. It turns out virtually every amazing organization had gone through a stall point in its 50-plus year history, going back to 50 years when the data was public. Number two, stalls are painful. If you suffer a stall, you lose your management team, you have a hard time recovering shareholder value, and you're basically in a bad place. But the most important lesson from their study, stalls are preventable. They're preventable. It turns out that management failure is at the heart of why these organizations stall. And if you think about the U.S. government, I wouldn't describe us as stalling. That may be a little too aggressive. But it shares the attributes. These are the three preventable causes. One, the notion that you're the best, and so you don't look over your shoulder to see who's behind you, to feel that competitive spirit. They call this premium position captivity. Second is that you lack the talent. That is, the people that brought you to the party aren't the skills that you need to take you to the next after party, the next round. So you've got to constantly replenish your talent and think about, they call this talent bench shortfall, that you got to imbue the organization with a new kind of thinking. And then last but not least, they did a terrible job of turning invention into innovation. More importantly, they failed to manage an innovation pipeline. This is the most important lesson, and the one that I wanted to highlight in the assignment I was handed by the president. The case study here is Kodak, which you can tell from the icon didn't fare well for Kodak. You may not remember this, but Kodak invented the VCR. Any of you buy a Kodak VCR? Don't raise your hand because they never made one. Their management team said, no one's going to spend $500 for one of these things, so we're not going to commercialize. They invented digital photography. Seeing a competitive threat to their film business, which by the way they had 90+% market share in the 70s and 80s, they chose not to invest. And this became a particularly thorny issue for me, because one of the cool things you get to do in the White House is encourage people to be invited to the First Lady's box in the State of the Union. That's like an awesome thing to be able to do. So, as you can tell, my folks are from India, so we're immigrants. I care a lot about immigration reform in general, and my assignment in part was this high skilled immigration piece. So we wanted to invite a guy named Mike Krieger to be the First Lady's guest. He's a Brazilian who studied at Stanford and couldn't get his paperwork to be an entrepreneur in the U.S. He ended up having to be an employee. He happened to have co-founded this little old company called Instagram, which in 2012, you couldn't find a more divergent story. Kodak declares bankruptcy in 2012. 8,000 people lose their jobs. Instagram, maybe 30 people on payroll, sold to Facebook for $1 billion. So this particular problem, which Wharton summed up the best, when new technologies change the world, some companies are caught off guard, others see change coming and are able to adapt. And then there's Kodak, which saw the future, parenthetical, also invented part of it, but simply couldn't figure out what to do. This was the heart of my assignment, and what I think characterizes an innovative state, that we build up that innovation pipeline. So you want to deliver low-cost food in food deserts? Well, one tool is we have this thing called food stamps. We have a huge political fight about whether we should expand food stamps or contract food stamps. But what if we could actually grow healthy food for 90% less the cost of what has to be subsidized with food stamps? I was with Clayton Christensen at Harvard Business School with a Republican former lieutenant governor of a state who raised this question, I don't want to make food stamps more efficient. We want to get rid of the program, or something to that effect. To which my response was, wrong definition of the innovation pipeline. The core of the problem in this example was the access to low-cost access to healthy food. And we presume a certain cost and then subsidize, and then fight the size of the subsidy. But what if we worked with entrepreneurs and innovators to actually find ways to bring that cost down? So innovation pipeline management will be the theme throughout the rest of my remarks as to what it is an innovative state fosters. Ideas from within the government, ideas from outside the government, but within an architecture of participation, and all of it focused on improving the way we deliver big, challenging problems for the country, delivering services and health, and energy, and education to the community. There are three specific attributes that I worked on for the president that are now effectively law or supported by existing statutes. I learned three case studies. One was Procter & Gamble, the second was Amazon, and the third was Facebook. First, I learned from Procter & Gamble that an important aspect of an innovation pipeline management philosophy is the CEO's commitment to change. And more importantly, their commitment to new ideas, even if those ideas originate from outside of the organization. P&G's famous Connect and Develop program was mind-bogglingly disruptive. Procter & Gamble, like many large companies, in the 70s and 80s, had a very well-defined research lab system. The best and the brightest would apply to go work for Procter & Gamble, and they would churn out new ideas every single day. Well, the CEO woke up one morning and said, you know what? As great as you are, I will only ask you to produce half of the new products that P&G will launch next year and over time. It's demoralizing. You're amazing, you're the best and the brightest, and now you're told you're only good for half the new ideas? So I asked Bruce Brown, the Chief Technology Officer, what did this do to his job? How did he react to this change? And it was so exciting, the story he shared, I said, you must tell the president. So this is Bruce Brown briefing the president on a really weird story that has to do with nuclear weapons and diapers. Okay. Turns out, diapers are really hard to make. The sophisticated kind. The kind that really knows how to absorb the urine at the base of the diaper. Turns out the water-absorbing pellets are really sensitive, valuable stuff. And you want to be really precise about where they're placed on the diaper in order to maximize comfort. And so, as Procter & Gamble, at scale, produces 1,000 diapers a minute, they were looking to find better ways to improve the accuracy of the pellet introduction. Well, there's this other material that's pretty sensitive in manufacturing, and that's nuclear material in weapons. And it turns out that the Los Alamos National Labs had built a very sophisticated modeling and simulation technique to optimize how and where they placed the nuclear material on the warhead to minimize particle dust and spillover effects. They opened up this algorithm for anyone. This is part of an open lab system. P&G incorporates the nuclear weapon modeling and simulation technique and generates $1 billion of cash flow benefit to shareholders on that one idea alone. So the president had to ad-lib his remarks that day, something to the effect of, who knew nuclear weapons could help with diapers, and it was much funnier than I just said. Second, Amazon. I'm a tech guy, so I worship at the altar of Jeff Bezos, and so, okay, he's supposed to be an awesome dude, whatever. What does that have to do with closing the innovation gap and managing innovation pipelines? What Bezos taught us was the importance of valuing frontline workers. Again, we're at the Woodrow Wilson School. There are students who graduate every single year who infiltrate the public sector. And if you were to ask them the same question I asked you, do you see yourself as an entrepreneur? That isn't naturally what they would look to in the mirror and say, yeah, that's me. I'm in the Bureau of Land, Mines, and whatever, and I'm an entrepreneur. No, I do my job, and I work within the regulatory construct, and I was taught that. So Bezos shares this story of empowering frontline workers. It turns out, like many CEOs, he rotates across the different divisions, and he sat in the call center for customer complaints, and he sat in someone's desk, and he received a phone call. The furniture you sent me is chipped. Oh, well, I'm sorry about that. Happy to send you a new one. Let's try better. Thank you for your service. Hangs up the phone. The person whose desk he's sitting at whispers somewhat aggressively, happens all the time. With this particular manufacturer, I get complaints about chipped furniture all the time. Bezos says something to the effect, I wasn't there, but something to the effect of, well, why don't you talk about this? And the call center rep, who probably makes $8 an hour, $12 an hour, laughingly, like, well, who am I going to tell? What, am I going to email you, Jeff, that there's a problem with this furniture? And he essentially says yes. And he decides to introduce the andon cord, which is at the center of the Toyota production system's lean methods. In the Toyota production system, if a frontline worker sees a defect on the assembly line, they can pull the andon cord and stop production, address the root cause of the problem, and fix it before it becomes a crisis. Amazon provides call center reps the andon cord to physically remove the item from the online catalog This is the lifeblood of their business. The products on the catalog are the website. And you're telling me an $8, $10 an hour rep can pull it from the website? And their boss can't reinstate it until they've done the assessment to judge whether or not there's been a problem? Powerful, empowering, and understanding in that lesson for me the value of frontline workers. By the way, it turned out that the manufacturer really appreciated the feedback. They were mispackaging the items, and this feedback helped them rethink the packaging, and then they had no problem going forward. Probably made them much more financially vibrant and viable had they learned this feedback earlier. Third, and perhaps the most important technically of the lessons that I learned, comes from Sheryl Sandberg at Facebook. Sheryl and I were on stage at an event for the President's Jobs Council. The premise being, what does the economy look like? How can we grow jobs in new and clever ways? And in preparation for the event, Sheryl asks her staff, at the time, there were maybe 3,000 people working at Facebook. She asks, how many people have the job title Facebook developer? Who wants to venture a guess? Have the job title Facebook developer. That's one. One's an option. Anyone else? 3,000. These are two extremes. Last choice. Last choice. Zero. The answer is 35,000. So who's good at math? What explains the difference? It's an open platform. Facebook took its developer platform and allowed Nike to employ a Facebook developer on Nike payroll to build a Nike Facebook app. And that got me thinking, if our 3 million plus civilian federal workers had that 10 to 1 leverage, imagine if we had 30 plus million Americans writing apps on the government operating system. Imagine how clever we would be, not just in having a working healthcare.gov, but one that meets your personal needs. Cat lovers want healthinsurance.com, right? Someone would come up with an algorithm that predicted exactly what insurance plans are best for those with cats. Whatever, I have no idea. This insight, in conjunction with the cultural points, gave me the roadmap for what we should be focused on to build the foundation, A, to close the gap, and B, to deliver what I call a more functioning innovative state. And if you had one additional takeaway from the remarks, just in your mind, remember, an innovative state is characterized by handshakes and handoffs. Just remember handshakes and handoffs. Handshakes is that point that these ideas are bipartisan, that the active ingredients, the enabling tools, if they're not already in the law, they're certainly in executive order, and they're not controversial. This is not the kind of stuff that's going to get you in trouble if you work for a Republican or a Democrat. The enablement of an innovative state is largely already put in place with handshakes. But, and this was hard for our communications staff to figure out, an innovative state isn't someone that can produce an awesome healthcare.gov. That's internal capacity. It's the handoff of the data in healthcare.gov to entrepreneurs and innovators who want to use that information combined with other things to be able to help people solve the mission objective, which is to have access to health plans that work for them. And that handoff is not something from the top down you can force. I can't make students at Woodrow Wilson to build a tool that helps people make higher ed decisions. What school should I attend? What major should I choose? I can't force you to build that service, but I can create the data conditions that would allow you the information you need, the feedback loops, to run algorithms to determine whether or not there's a computational answer to what the best advice is for every child in America. Yesterday's New York Times that had a big story about the fact that the poor kids in New York City that have the choice of a local school actually don't go to the better schools. And the research around that is why. Is this a function of the government not doing its job, like investing in that last, should there be like a government employee at every person's door? Maybe. Should the Robin Hood Foundation build power families to make smarter choices on their dime and with their support systems? Should LinkedIn find ways to build this feature set into its core product and not monetize it as part of its overall strategy to build up its social network? Handoffs are about others, us, realizing the potential of an innovative state. That's the most important point. And there are 4 specific techniques that enable the handoffs. Opening up government data, convening people around standards, thinking about prizes and challenges to find non-traditional solvers, and thinking about lean government startups formed of public and private stakeholders to make small, well-defined problems manageable through these programs. Let's spend a minute on each, and then I'll wrap into a conversation. The first idea is that we want to democratize government data. And what I tried to do in the book was to put historical context around each of these ideas. Not to say that they're all brand new and look at this fancy, shiny object, but rather we've had a history of this. And it turns out, I'm a Virginian, so I was particularly proud that Mr. Jefferson was our nation's first open government innovator. It turns out that Jefferson was a bit of a weather nut. He would calculate the weather twice a day, every day, and share it with those who shared this passion. He opened up the weather data. And in fact, he noted that in 1776, July 4th, in Philly, where he bought the equipment locally, it was clear and mild with a high of 76 degrees. The spirit of Jefferson carried forward when he was President Jefferson, when he dispatched Lewis and Clark to discover the West. Part of his instructions were for them to collect data on the climate and to report back to the people what they found. Today, Jefferson's philosophy that weather data is open and free of intellectual property constraint or pricing constraint fuels a $5 billion a year private sector industry. How do you get the weather data? Yahoo weather apps? Weather.com? Your TV station? Your radio station? These sites all use the same data set. It comes from the Commerce Department, NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. This department spends billions, sensors, satellites, collecting all this data. And it produces this free open hose for anyone to consume. And oh, by the way, you need not be an expert in weather to consume it. One of our favorite case studies is a startup called Climate Corporation, who thought that they could combine weather data with census data and other government data sets to create a more precise algorithm to figure out the risks a farmer should mitigate and those they can ignore, being more precise around crop insurance. I don't know how innovative crop insurance products are, but these young kids designed this open data strategy, and oh, by the way, within a few years, Monsanto bought it for $1 billion. You can be wildly, disgustingly commercially successful helping the world solve big problems. The default setting of government as of now, this is the president's executive order, but Eric Cantor and Darrell Issa have memorialized the spirit of this in the Data Act, now make APIs. APIs are the lingua franca for how that Facebook developer system works. They well define how to access the developer platform. It's now the default setting in government. When we have a database, for compliance reasons, collecting data on anything you can imagine, we are now asking the agencies to publish application programming interfaces so you and I in a weekend can consume the data. My wife and I have a third child. Our son is 4 months old. We're blessed. But I hate car seats. You stick your knee in the darn thing, you squeeze it, you push it in, you get the thing, you bring your hands. It sucks. Turns out the Department of Transportation keeps a database. The ease of installation for every production car seat in America. I'm not visiting the Department of Transportation.gov to find this random database. But over a weekend, when someone mentioned that 50% of Americans misinstall the car seat, someone in the audience, not unlike this, went onto a computer and built a mobile app so that it knows your GPS signal and it can tell you exactly not only options for shopping, but more importantly, where you can go to test, a database of where you can go to test whether your car seat's been properly installed. Simple, easy, lightweight, improves our lives. The power of APIs. This, according to McKinsey, is a $3 to $5 trillion boon in economic or consumer surplus value. So not all economic returns are cash benefits to investors. These are benefits to society for having people live safer, better, healthier lives. But McKinsey's estimate is, by opening up data in these regulated sectors, education, transportation, consumer products, oil and gas, healthcare, and finance, we now have the ability to unlock all of this potential. Entrepreneurs will make lots of money. The country will see better services and products to make our lives work better. The awkward point is you may not know that it's powered by the government. Like if you looked at Yahoo Weather, I don't think when you look at Yahoo Weather, it's like, hey, this is a service of the Commerce Department. Because why would you know that? And so it is the tension of the handshakes and the handoffs that the political communications people can't take credit for all these apps, because it's kind of like entrepreneurs doing the work, but we all benefit. And that's the conundrum of an innovative state, if you embrace enabling these sectors to become more productive. Second, I never in my right mind thought I would say something nice about Herbert Hoover. And I don't mean that because, my partisanship. I mean that because I don't remember in the history books reading how awesome he was. Yet here it turns out he's an open government innovator too. At the end of World War I, Herbert Hoover is Secretary of Commerce. And America faces a conundrum. We, of course, with the Wright brothers, invent aircraft and flight. But by the end of World War I, with the government's contracts buying planes plummeting, we're not making them anymore. Europe, seeing an opportunity to invest in a, quote, new industry, invests and subsidizes lots of competitors, and we're losing market share, and we're like in a bit of a turmoil. Hoover's philosophy is not for government to get directly involved. So when the call came from the industry, can you subsidize us, bail us out, help us out, etc., his instinct is to say no. But he's stuck because he doesn't want America to lose this extraordinary opportunity. So he uncovers a new model for economic development, and it's called the associative state. He asks the industry to consistently define the problems as they see them. What are the reasons why our aircraft aren't performing well? And let's see if we can form a public-private partnership to address those specific concerns. It turns out we had an engineering problem. We weren't very good at designing airfoils or engine cowlings. So the predecessor to NASA is born and funded to do joint collaborative R&D around airfoils and engine cowlings. And wouldn't you know it, within the decade, the two most successful aircraft of their era, the DC-3 and the Boeing 247, share the intellectual property from Hoover's associative state around the airfoil and cowlings designs. They compete on the package and services and other things. So you have this interesting scenario where the government isn't just a subsidizer, but a convener, collaborator, and bringing together these opportunities to solve problems. I took from this that in the internet will eventually be born out an education internet, a health internet, an energy internet, etc. And what I mean by that is not physically separate internets. What I mean is a layer of security for protection of privacy and these higher levels of policy objectives that leverage the capacity of the internet, but address these common problems. Doctors aren't exactly sending medical records to you on Gmail, right? And if they are, they're violating HIPAA. And so that's awful. But if more doctors began sharing your medical records through the internet, you could be much better informed about the opportunities to stay on top of your health and to make sure that you've been reminded in case there's a service that you've missed, because some of us see multiple doctors. So if we had a consistent approach to opening up data in health, in energy, in education, these regulated markets that need the help, perhaps we could unleash the power of the internet to make these sectors more productive. Well, we went about doing that work. Now, there is a blue button standard. If any of you in this room are on Medicare, every single one of you can safely and securely download your claims history with the push of a simple blue button for free. Any of you push your Medicare blue button? One of you. And did you just keep it on your computer, or did you share it with someone?
No, I looked at it and then closed the computer,
Sure.
so no one else could.
But in theory, if your primary care doctor, who doesn't know when you've been to the hospital or you saw that specialist and doesn't have all of your data, if that primary care doctor said, hey, would you be willing to share that file with me so I can make sure I'm on top of all the things that are happening in your life so I can serve you better, you may or may not accept that offer. The challenge was the technical agreements for how information should flow safely and securely. So, in education, it's the My Data button. Every student has the technical capacity. Now, you have to adopt it, so the schools are slower to adopt than hospitals and healthcare. But in healthcare, 100 million Americans have the ability to push the blue button. Not just because of the Medicare and the VA and the DoD, but Walmart, CVS, all these retailers are signing up voluntarily to adopt the same open standard. Education and energy data standards are equally part of this associative state philosophy. In fact, Congress, in a bipartisan act, called for this convening role in energy and health and education. And we think more can be done in cybersecurity and in other areas where you harness the capacity and understanding of the private sector to solve these big thorny problems, not with the government dictating top-down, but sitting at the table convening associative state style as Hoover envisioned. Third, issuing challenges and prizes. Again, a bipartisan act of Congress now has empowered every federal agency to issue challenges and prizes in lieu of government procurement up to $50 million in value. And you can visit any of them at challenge.gov. The principle of challenge.gov had its origins in the 1700s in the UK. We had a hard time in the world finding longitude at sea. And in Scilly, about 1,000 or 1,400 soldiers died because they could not determine longitude at sea. At the time, there was a pretty smart physicist walking the earth, Sir Isaac Newton. So the government said, Sir Isaac Newton, oh, Godfather, can you help us solve this problem and save sailor lives? Newton scratches his head, thinking about the stars. Can't quite figure out a way to do it, looking at the sky. So the UK government issues a challenge. They put up a $20,000 pound purse, which is over $3 million today. And a local watchmaker by the name of Harrison conceives of the chronometer. Now my guess is if you were to rank the physicists who were supposed to be involved in solving this problem, Harrison's name would not even be in the top 1,000. But by putting up this open prize and allowing anyone in, you can see what people can do. The non-traditional solver often has the best ideas. It's not in the slides, but I'll just share a funny story because it was the first challenge that we issued under this authority. It turns out that Homeland Security had this interesting little problem. People would go to a kind of a checkpoint where they're supposed to stop and show their ID and whatnot. And people were like hitting the accelerator and gunning through the choke point. And they're trying to figure out, we don't want to like shoot and kill people. You know, is there a way to bring that car to a thoughtful stop without shooting guns and doing things? So they went through a regular procurement, and some weird product called Squid gets a multi-million-dollar contract. And here's how Squid works. If the car happens to drive over a pre-positioned little device, and the cop, at that moment, pushes a button, then Squid shoots out these tentacles that can grab the tire and stop the car. Okay, but the probability that either of those things will happen in sequential order is like 0. So this was a useless multi-million-dollar contract. Air Force has checkpoints. Air Force says, we want to solve this same problem. We're going to put up a $15,000 prize on the incentive platform. And we want to test an R&D prototype of this thing. A 63-year-old retired radio engineer from Peru designs effectively a Roomba that can go 0 to 60 in 3 seconds. And it, like, if you ever watched Speed Racer, as a kid, I loved this cartoon Speed Racer. There's this, like, the Mach 5 is this awesome car, and you push a button and the car can jump. So he creates this Roomba-powered device that has a airbag on it, and if you can, like a remote control, drive this Roomba under the car, and you push the Mach 5 button, it basically lifts the car off the ground with this oversized airbag. Pretty awesome. And $15,000, retired Peruvian engineer. Wasn't on the DoD's government contractor list. Neither was Victor Garcia, a Mexican immigrant who came to this country at the age of 5, was a Sizzler waiter, saw a TV ad that said, you too can design auto, like, you know, be an auto designer. So he enrolls in a technical institute to be an auto designer. But I don't think he was particularly awesome at it. I don't know his grades, but he ended up as an entry-level contract worker at Peterbilt Trucking, where I don't think anyone in management knew his name. His contractor status means that he didn't have health insurance, and so his wife gets pregnant and he needs the money to buy health insurance for the pregnancy. At the exact same time, the military is grappling with something that at the time was a joke and ended up not being a joke, and that's called Augustine's Law. Not the religious Augustine, Norm Augustine, the former Assistant Secretary of Defense. Does anyone know what Augustine's Law is? No. The joke of Augustine's Law, made in the 80s, was that the rate of unit cost inflation in making combat aircraft was rising so fast that the budgets of the Defense Department, rising more of in a linear fashion, these two would at some point meet, and he predicted the year 2054, where the entirety of the DoD budget would have to be consumed to produce one combat aircraft to be shared by the Air Force, the Marines. It was a joke. The Economist in 2012 looked at where we've been over the last 20 some odd years. Yep, exactly on target. The Joint Strike Fighter, totally over budget, unit cost through the roof, exactly where Augustine predicted it would be. So the DoD decides through DARPA, frankly, that it wants to upend the way it builds, design and build products. It doesn't want to 5-10% improvement, this thing. This isn't a lean Six Sigma, squeeze the waste and inefficiency. This is 80%, okay, dramatic reductions. So to prototype this, they decide that they're going to crowdsource the design. We just talked crowdsourcing. Can anybody in America help us design a combat support vehicle that can help 2 injured soldiers from the battlefield? Oh, and by the way, the DoD, in their infinite wisdom, offered 3 whole weeks for the competition. It takes 3 weeks to add a comma to a Defense Department RFP. So this is unheard of. Yet, 20,000 designers get the text, the tweet, the Facebook post to inspire them to participate. Victor sees it, saw the price tag or the prize bonus of around $10,000, of which he would get $7,500 for coming in first place, and he puts his heart and soul into the design. Produces the design for the flip mode. The DoD wasn't interested in his design on paper. He wanted it produced, not in years, but in weeks or months. So an open source manufacturing team called Local Motors in Arizona takes Victor's design, and with Victor's help, they turn it into a working prototype. And one of the coolest days of the job, I get to call the head of DARPA, and I say, is there any way Victor and the team can make it to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in June of 2011? And they don't ask why, but the presumption if I'm calling is that it's the president. And it turns out that, first of all, Victor and the team did wheelies in the car. They were like, jumping berms and stuff, all excited. They showed up, I think a week before his daughter was born, to say, the president wanted to say thank you. Who are you, Victor Garcia and Local Motors team? And we have Victor and Victoria Garcias in every single corner of the country. And they have this talent. And we have created artificial barriers to stop us from finding these people to bring their ideas to life. So challenge.gov now has hundreds of these examples, and they're slowly but surely making a difference. How many of you, not to be political, but how many of you believe in climate change? Sorry to be awkward, but we're at a university setting. So, okay, fine. A good chunk of us. Now, lots of political debate about whether it's real or not, and political fights over this. It's pretty ugly. Turns out one thing, not so ugly. Red tape. It turns out whether you believe in climate change or not, the country, including the township of Princeton, imposes a $1 billion hidden tax on solar permits, making it a pain in the neck. It's kind of like waiting for the cable guy. And all this rigmarole. Germany has found a way to get to same-day permitting for solar. And if you benchmark Germany's costs against ours, there's a $1 billion gap when you project it out. So we've got a $10 million prize. Race to the rooftops. If we can get utility companies, mayors, entrepreneurs to get to same-day permitting, the team that can help us get there will drive the cost of solar to $1 a watt, and at $1 a watt, it's cost competitive with coal. And we can do this by 2016 through entrepreneurship. So how many political fights do you have to say, let's get rid of the permitting red tape. Let's get to same-day permitting and make it all internet-friendly and cool and hip and nice. Uber for solar panels, or someone will come up with something. And all of a sudden, we've done something to dramatically address an issue that people have been fighting over for a generation. And it's sitting right in front of us. And we didn't have to have World War III with Congress to approve it. Last, launching lean government startups. Here I was on more familiar ground, honoring Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy, under the spirit that our country is at its best when people believe, are you good enough for government? That was the mantra in the Kennedy era. Are you good enough to land a job in the public sector? And that philosophy carried over into how we built up the capacity for World War II. You all, I'm sure, reading all the books, and they're all revisiting the history here. The $1-a-year men, unfortunately they were all men, 300 corporate CEOs and chief technology officers banded together with the government to form essentially a lean startup, or multiple lean startups, to quintuple production of aluminum and all the rest that they had to do. This is Knudsen from GM, who jokes with Roosevelt that none of the $1-a-year men voted for him. They're all Republican, you see. But they came to serve, and Roosevelt asks, why can't you find a Democrat amongst you? And Knudsen responds, none of them could afford the $1-a-year salary. This back and forth would seem to be unheard of today. Yet, here we are. The Presidential Innovation Fellowship. We now are actively recruiting the best and the brightest from Silicon Valley and from all over the country to join the government to help build better services. The team that rescued healthcare.gov, Presidential Innovation Fellows. The team that's building a whole new way of interacting with the government through the new MyUSA portal, Presidential Innovation Fellows. You want tools to help veterans choose which higher education institution for them to visit to use their 9/11 benefits and avoid the ones that are going to land them in economic ruin? Presidential Innovation Fellowship Program. These entrepreneurs are coming in. My favorite is RFPEZ, because everybody hates procurement. It's pretty much evil incarnate, and I can never fix it because it's just evil. And one of the aspects of evil is that it's almost designed to be inefficient by choice. So the RPEZ team said, hey, let's form a team with the government employees. So these are very simple. Half government employees, entrepreneurs in government, half private sector entrepreneurs who form specific teams to go after well-defined problems. So here in this case, websites, ironically they launched this before the disaster in healthcare.gov, but websites that could cost less than $150,000. They realized that they had this authority all along that you don't have to go through fedbizops.gov and all the procurement headaches that people go through. Anyone, you could compete for RFPEZ and help put a team together and build a website for an agency for 25 grand if you wanted to. They opened up the process, and 5 agencies wrote a procurement that went on the traditional fedbizops.gov and went on RFPEZ, right? This is a lean startup. You wanted to experiment. Randomized control trial. They did exactly, what happened is exactly as you might imagine it. Hundreds of companies that had never done business with the government before responded to RFPEZ. Prices fell on average 30%. The work got done faster and with much more reliability. And that was all because of a lean startup. So I want to now revisit healthcare.gov. And I want to tell you that it's actually my favorite story for an innovative state. And you're going to look at me like I'm crazy. There's actually 2 healthcare.govs. There's the healthcare.gov that went live in July of 2010. 90 days, essentially, after the passage of the law. And the one that went live with a thud in October of 2013. How many of you visited the July 2010 version of healthcare.gov? It was intended by Congress to be the nation's very first and most comprehensive database of public and private insurance options that, long before the new health plans that met all the criteria for Obamacare kicked in 2014, they just wanted to say, before we wait for the new plans, you have to buy amongst the crappy ones today, so let's at least give you a full inventory. And we asked every insurance company, public and private, to tell us 2 things about them that had never been disclosed before. 1, how frequently they denied access to the plan, and how frequently they surcharged someone with a pre-existing condition. Had never been collected before. The story of this website predates the signing of the law. In January, Ed Mullen, who lives here in New Jersey, this dude with the farmer-looking kind of thing, this guy, lives here in Jersey, is watching the political debate and saying, I think if the American people could see a health insurance exchange, physically touch one, or at least on the web, look at it, maybe they'll like this thing. So without a government procurement and money and anything, he designs myhealth.gov. Now, prior to social media, he would have done this and his friends and neighbors would have said, well, that's nice. Nice little Ed. I'm proud of you. But Ed went on Twitter and mentions my colleague Megan Phillips at the White House, the president's digital, whitehouse.gov digital. And Megan sees this design and is like, whoa, this is pretty awesome. Who is this guy? And we circulate it around, and as soon as the bill is signed, and we know that this assignment's due in 90 days, we called up Ed Mullen, and it's like, hey, can you be the lead designer for healthcare.gov? And he did. Look at the site. Not that far off from the design that he initiated. My successor, Todd Park, in part was, the reason he's my successor, is that he CEO'd this lean startup, powered by government employees and a few outsiders to make a difference. It was so successful that the president became the first sitting president to do a live demo of the website on whitehouse.gov. You can Google Obama healthcare.gov live demo, and you can see him on his Mac playing around with the tool. But this is the most powerful point of the speech tonight. We cared, but not really cared if people visited healthcare.gov. We opened up all the data through an API, remember Facebook developer, and one of the first companies to make use of it, you've all heard of US News or World Report? Their health insurance finder is 100% powered by the data from the original healthcare.gov to this day. You might like the U.S. News Health Insurance Finder. It might provide value and context for you in figuring out plans that you like. And they don't necessarily have to broadcast that it's coming to you from the government. But they've built it because we opened up the data. The marginal cost to create that product is de minimis. You all have heard of Uber? Uber just announced a service for their drivers. Whether you like them, hate them, worship them, whatever your view is, their drivers are contract workers who need to buy health insurance. They've contracted with a startup called Stride Health, which also consumes data from healthcare.gov. And now they can talk to drivers about their specific back conditions and their personalized needs, and they're filtering all the health plans to optimize the ones that have the best quality scores for their needs. This is the power of an innovative state. And I wanted to conclude with the notion that government is in fact working. The recovery of healthcare.gov is just now getting to be told as a story. But what you may not know is that the president has been courting CEOs, CTOs, leaders from the private sector to join in the cause. And one of the attendees who heard the pitch from the president, recruiter-in-chief, was a beautiful young lady by the name of Megan Smith, who happened to be running Google X. An inventor, an entrepreneur, a rock star, one of the most powerful role models, not only for women, but all technologists. Here's the president's pitch and says, I'm quitting, and now she's the nation's third chief technology officer. She replaced Todd Parker because she had exposure to the recruiter-in-chief. I want to end with one last story about how this might work now that I'm out of government. I worked on a project to map the unemployed veterans' skills gap. I was frustrated by the fact that despite all this sort of goodwill to help veterans land jobs in the civilian sector, the unemployment rate for veterans remains stubbornly high. And my hypothesis was we're not taking full advantage of new technologies. So I asked the CEO of LinkedIn, the founder of Workday, Monster, and others, and I said, would you freely join an open data collaborative to help us understand whether or not the workforce system is optimizing for our veterans? So we did something pretty interesting. We built a skills gap map. We read every job posting that an employer posted on the internet with an explicit veteran hiring commitment, about 600,000 job postings. We ran them to the LinkedIn skills engine, and you can see that in Wythe County, Virginia, healthcare skills are the second most common for jobs. And Smith County, which is not that far from Wythe, there are 3 young veterans who are looking for jobs as medical aides. They would not have known about each other had there not been this sort of, think of it as a skills genome project. So we mapped the job postings with unemployment data on what the skills are for unemployed vets, and we were able to visualize and allow people to interact. This is veteranstalent.io. And here's the part that was both depressing and exciting. Depressing. Every entry-level technology job posted in Virginia from employers who want to hire veterans, every single one of them, 28% of all tech jobs are entry-level, every one of them could be filled by an unemployed Virginian veteran who may not have tech skills in their background, but based on a big data algorithm, they are tech trainable. Today, those vets don't know to apply to the tech jobs, and the employers don't know to look for these tech trainable vets. And so we've lost this opportunity to grow the economy and tap into the expertise of all of our country's talents. This is just a small taste of what we can do in the spirit of a more innovative state. Thank you for hearing me out. We have a few, 5-10 minutes for questions. If anyone has questions, I'm happy to respond. Yes, sir. Tell us your name.
Arch Davis, an alum here, and a computer scientist by training.
Perfect.
The recovery of healthcare.gov is quite remarkable. But,
Yes, indeed.
but the disaster that started, as I understand, was due to corruption that Michelle Obama gave the job to her college roommate or something like that.
not so much. What happened in the contract, this gets to the problem of procurement. In 2007, remember, Obama is elected in 2008. So 2007 is the Bush administration. CMS down selects 15 software companies, including CGI, to perform services, ill-defined services in the future. It turns out one of the problems why procurement is so evil is if you had an open competition on day one, it would take a year to write the solicitation, a year to pick the vendors, and today every vendor that loses immediately files a protest. The Defense Department basically calls this, they're the sufferers, meaning the procurement system is rigged to help the contractors, and the person who needs the job done, the time constraints to get the job done are not part of the equation. So if you did the math, the likelihood, and I wasn't involved in any of the procurement, they keep that away from the White House, but the judgment was, let's use existing contractors that we have on staff. In this case, the contractor that had built the Medicare Part D exchange. And that vendor had already been pre-qualified, and assuming others competed too, but when you say, hey, I built the Part D exchange, now I can do the regular exchange, that the presumption was that they had the capacity. What's amazing is not that the vendor was bad. It's not like 7 people wore Superman capes, flew in and like fixed the day. No, 7-ish, maybe 8 people, including my successor, whom I love dearly, they swooped in, but they reorganized what work people were doing. It's the same CGI employees fixed the website. They were just not told where to focus their energies. So my mentor, Jeff Zients, who happened to have been the president's chief performance officer, also the person who hired me for This Is How Small the World Is, he hired me in 1996 for my first professional job. He is a management guru, and he says, I want a punch list of the problems that need to be solved, rank them, and then assign people to go get them done. And that's essentially what they did. They didn't invent new physics. They didn't buy new software from scratch. They didn't rewrite the whole program. They took the existing team, the existing chassis, the existing systems, put better discipline around it, made better judgments about what should or shouldn't be in scope or out of scope, so there wasn't a lot of this. Basically having a CEO in charge of the business who could make those decisions. And that's how they launched it. So that's the nature of the failure on the original healthcare.gov. And I'm sure there'll be more stories about the details, but that's the big, big, big picture. It was this contracting, one of the big reasons was contracting. The second reason is political, and I note it in the book. One thing I did work on, it had always been the Affordable Care Act's mission that states would build these exchanges. And we put $250 million out to 7 states, including red states, Oklahoma, Kansas, and then blue states, Maryland, Massachusetts. And they were supposed to build these tools and then in an open source way share back what they've learned so that others could be the early adopters and others could save on the implementation time. 3 of the states had new governors elected in the time when they applied for the grant and when we gave them the grant in 2010. Brownback in Kansas, and I forgot her name, in Oklahoma. And they just said, we hate Obamacare, so we're sending the money back. Oklahoma was personally frustrating for me because the staff that put the proposal together for the Oklahoma experience was the most innovative, forward-looking, dynamic, and exciting option I'd ever seen. And they worked so hard to put their proposal together, and then it was just Mary Fallon. It was just politics that they had to turn all the money. They got $85 million to build the prototype. It would have been a phenomenal success. That's the one thorny issue on some of this. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for your remarks. It's really exciting stuff. One question I had is sort of around this perceived gap between potential innovators or entrepreneurs that might be able to take open source data and do something really cutting edge with it, exciting with it, and then the actual ability to sort of scope the problem and have an accurate understanding of the problem. So you see this a lot at the municipal level where local government officials will do a hackathon.
Sure.
But there's this like...
They lack a business model.
Sure. So what do you see as the, like the
Healthcare.
ingredients, like the bridge?
We're going to see innovative state and healthcare at first. Here's why. At the same exact time we're opening up more data, we are changing the payment incentives for how hospitals and doctors get paid. And when you change the incentives to focus on value or outcomes, which by the way is a very bipartisan spirit of the original law, that changes the nature of the tools that doctors and hospitals need in order to do their work. Today, if you sell IT to doctors and hospitals, you're largely focused on documentation accuracy for better billing and collections. Tomorrow, it's about the list of patients that didn't come in to see you today, that probably should have because they're about to crash. And if I can anticipate them crashing, I might reach out and address their issue while they're still reasonably healthy before we have an unnecessary heart attack admission to the hospital. And so the most entrepreneurial companies, McKinsey estimates about 200 new products and services in just the first 2 years of our doing this, have been born on health data tied to this new payment reform model. And in fact, today's Harvard Business Review has a wonderful article by my former colleague Bob Kocher, who outlines all the business problems that open data, technology, transparency should help address, and how much money they can make if they were successful.
So do you think the onus is mostly on government to sort of redefine metrics around outcomes then to help guide?
These are so if you think about innovation pipeline management, one of the things that you will, and I didn't say as much of this tonight, but the basic principle of it is you want to test, you want to validate, and then you want to scale. Hackathons are great to test. You need to have a hypothesis to validate that the test actually worked, and then you need some mechanism to scale. So here's an example. Those veterans that are tech trainable, they probably don't want to enroll at Princeton, and they may not be a part of the opportunity to come here. They may not want a 4-year degree to be in computer science. They might want to enroll in a 6-month boot camp that focuses explicitly on the skills that they're missing. And today, those boot camps are not tuition reimbursable, not accredited universities. So part of what I'm working on now is an idea around on-ramps for outcomes-based learning models, such that we could, in fact, get the tuition assistance to reward programs that are very laser-focused on the gaps in the marketplace. And as an example, if you're an Army combat medic, I don't know if any of you served in the military, but if you're an Army medic, 68 whiskey, you've got half the skills you need to be a, call it a kind of a EMT. But today's EMT programs assume that you know nothing, and so you start with everybody else, and so you've wasted, it's 2 years to do it. So imagine if someone could build a 1-year EMT for veterans. Today, that tuition reimbursement may not really quite get to where you want to be. You might want to double the tuition, so it's the same price, but you're compressing the time, and you want that reward. You can do that legally under the GI Bill, but there isn't a clear roadmap for how to do that. You got to do that. I'm working on that.
So we do have Project Management Institute has a charity arm which is called the Education Fund. So
Yes.
we actually give money for
You
this
subsidize the
institute.
veteran tuition.
Yes.
And there's lots of opportunities like that, and those are great, and I love them. Part of what I'm trying to say is we spend multiple billions of dollars a year in the official workforce training programs, and so as much as I love the people that are subsidizing it out of their goodwill, what I really want is to fix the core systems, and fixing the core systems is being much more transparent about the outcomes, and having 90% of the schools that take student loans are not competitive to get into. More than 90%. There's 7,000 schools in the IPEDS database that collect tuition reimbursement. And maybe the 500, maybe if you stretched it, are competitive, where you have to apply, and everything else is walk right in. Well, they have massively divergent outcomes. If I knew which of those walk-in programs, I have the choice. I'd go left versus right, and I just sentenced my professional life to doom. So more tools will be born to try to help make that happen, and if they're rewarded, that's, anyway, I can lecture all
So
that.
I think
All right, last one, and then we're gonna rock and roll.
one last one we have.
What do you
Yes,
think
sir.
of the idea of requiring government agencies to conduct surveys
Yes,
of the users of their services and make it public, the results public, so that
I love
the
that idea.
legislature, I've
It
tried.
doesn't happen.
No, it doesn't.
Do you know why?
Why?
Presidential Records Act. We have a law that constrains any time the government wants to ask questions of the public, we're not allowed to just put up a survey form. It's illegal. We have to go through a 6, 9, 12, maybe 2-year review cycle where you write the survey instrument. You have to write documentation to justify why you're asking these questions. You then have to study the burdens, how much time is it going to take people to fill out? Is it unduly burdensome? You then put it out for public comment. People will complain, I don't want to fill out that form. I don't want that form. And so no agency in their right mind even bothers because they know, why would I waste my time? Because the Presidential Records Act inhibits
That's for federal agencies.
federal
But
agencies.
the states don't.
States could do it in a heartbeat.
But they don't.
They could.
I know.
There's nothing about, this is what you're describing is a new data set.
Yes.
I would describe that as partnerships with Yelp, where you disclose the corporate IDs for every agency in the public sector. Yelp can incorporate that data set like any other, and the public can do what it wants to give feedback, reviews, ratings, whatnot, and that's a public-private. What you would do with the government is simply say, publish the list of the facilities, what services are offered at those facilities, what their address is, and some of that detail that Yelp uses for its purpose. You make it an open data set, and maybe someone launches govyelp.com, and they are better than Yelp, and they make $1 billion creating govyelp.com. Or we get Ed Felton in the house, who's standing right over there, who's my hero, and we get Ed Felton to create something to do something even better. Right, Ed Felton?
That's right, whatever you say.
All right. Thank you all for hearing me